Well, hello and welcome to Rare Classic Cars. It's a beautiful sunny day here. Hope everybody's doing well. For those who have been followers of this channel for some time, you probably noticed that I tend to look at and critique domestic vehicles. So I thought I'd try something a little bit different and also a hybrid of what you've seen in terms of formats. So a little bit of discussion as well as a video. And I wanted to talk about a vehicle that I no longer have, but I had for probably 8 years, and that was my 1985 Honda CRX. Was it a sports car? Was it a commuter car? Was it just a fun vehicle? It was, I guess, kind of all of the above. So let's talk a little bit more about the CRX and its evolution, and then we'll even go for a virtual test drive right now. Are you ready? For those Honda owners, you'll recognize these noises. Here we go. Beep, 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 boom. It's the sound of every Honda starting up, at least older Hondas. Take a look at this clip, and then we'll come back and talk about the car.
Marketed as an economical, sporty commuter car with no frills and not even a back seat, Honda introduced the Civic CRX in 1984 and continued its production until 1991. The CRX shared the Civic drivetrain, but it offered unique styling and an interior more suited towards sport than touring. By 1980 standards, the car was small, but by modern-day standards, it's downright diminutive. With an 87-inch wheelbase and a 144-inch length, the CRX measured barely over 12 feet long and weighed in at about 1,800 pounds. Yes, that's right, 1,800 pounds, with some models focused on high fuel efficiency weighing even less. Both engines were CVCC engines, or compound vortex controlled combustion in Honda speak, and these engines had unique features including an extra intake valve and a pre-chamber where a rich mixture of fuel to air would be introduced, then ignited by the spark plug before proceeding along into the main combustion chamber where a leaner mixture was introduced. Honda had originally invented this technology as a way to circumvent the more expensive catalytic converters required by most cars to meet emissions, and it was highly successful, although it required the use of many, many vacuum lines in later years to make the vehicles emissions compliant. In fact, there were so many vacuum lines under hood that Honda actually printed numbers on the vacuum lines so that they could be readily spotted in the service manual and replaced appropriately. In addition to the myriad vacuum hoses, the car under hood had a 3-barrel Keyhine carburetor, as well as several quote-unquote control boxes that controlled the vacuum to various accessories designed to reduce emissions. It worked, but boy, if you had a problem, it surely was a mess. And despite this mess, the CRX was the first car in the U.S. that was able to top 50 miles per gallon in EPA tests, an amazing feat for the time and even for today. As 1985 rolled around, Honda changed the CRX lineup a bit, now having the HF, DX, and SI models. They all came with 1.5-liter engines, but the HF came with a special engine and gearing that enabled it to achieve even higher miles per gallon than the DX version. The DX had a standard 1.5-liter with 76 horsepower. The new 1985 SI came with a 1.5-liter engine, but now had fuel injection, and it made 91 horsepower as opposed to the DX's 76 horsepower. The fuel injection also enabled Honda to delete the CVCC engines pre-chambers because the fuel injection engine was able to attain emission standards even without them. While 76 or 91 horsepower don't sound like much today, remember this car only weighed 1,800 pounds, and the acceleration for the time was actually quite good, with a regular Honda Civic CRX DX model turning in a 0 to 60 time of 10.4 seconds and a quarter mile of about 17.4 seconds. The SI was considerably quicker at 9.1 seconds 0 to 60 and could do the quarter mile in 16.4 seconds. These times certainly sound slow today, but remember that even in the late 70s, a Corvette took about 9 seconds to go 0 to 60. So they were relatively fast for the time, and certainly faster than many of the mainstream cars outfitted with standard four-cylinder engines. In 1986, the CRX received some minor updates, including its headlights, which were now smoother in form, and the SI also now had color-matched body cladding. The first generation CRX ended production in 1987, but not before it had endeared itself in the hearts of sports car enthusiasts as well as economically focused commuters alike. And I can say from personal experience, the car was an absolute gem and joy to drive, at least when it was running correctly. The steering had an extremely lithe feel to it in spite of its completely manual effort without power assist. The handling was good for the time, although not great on 13-inch tires. And while the American companies were often churning out four cylinders that were crude, rude, and raucous, this 1.5-liter engine that Honda put out was nothing short of a little gem. And when coupled to an extremely smooth-shifting 5-speed manual transmission, rowing through the gears was nothing more than a pleasure. The engine also had surprisingly good mid-range punch, especially if you unhooked the EGR valve, which you actually could do on this car. The compression ratio wasn't high enough that it would spark knock without it, and it gave extremely good throttle response. When the accelerator was fully depressed, the motor would start moving toward its 6,000 RPM red line, and the amazing thing about the experience was that the sensation of vibration was no greater at 6,000 RPMs than it was at idle. The front torsion bar suspension and rear axle delivered overall a good ride and handling balance. Not great. There definitely was noise intrusion going over bumps. But remember, this was a cheap, economical commuter car, and it certainly achieved its mission of being fun to drive as well as inexpensive. Today, the first generation CRXs are extremely rare, and many of them have met their demise and are now at the graveyard in the sky. While the engines and transmissions often lasted a long time, although some of these engines did have head gasket issues, the bodies used paper-thin sheet metal and rusted whenever a chipmunk would break wind in their direction. Today, if you're searching for a CRX, my best advice is to ensure that you give it a thorough once-over, especially for rust, and look for the rust in areas in the wheel wells and arches, as well as around the front torsion bar suspension and areas where a shop would put lift pads to raise the vehicle. I would also advise checking and asking a previous owner when the last time was that the timing belt was serviced as well as the water pump. Those should both be serviced at the same time, and they need to be changed with relative frequency now, even if the car has low miles, just because they're getting old. Also, don't plan on being able to readily find a place to service these vehicles any longer, especially the carbureted engines with their sea of vacuum hoses under hood. Many shops, even Japanese specialty shops, will not touch them, so you might want to plan on being on your own for having to wrench on this car, as I did. And while many things are simple under hood, they can be time-consuming, especially tracing vacuum leaks or issues with drivability, given the bevy of vacuum hoses, control boxes, and solenoids on the carbureted cars. My best advice, if you're going to buy a Honda of this generation, is to stick with fuel-injected models, as you don't want that headache. That said, for the lucky few who are able to locate a first-generation CRX, they will most certainly enjoy a vehicle that is unparalleled in today's market. There simply is no offering at any automaker today that offers the combination of lightweight, excellent ride and handling balance, as well as an economical price. Be persistent and keep hunting, and good luck.
Well, I guess after that, the question remains, what was the car like to drive? And, obviously I love the big domestic iron And the CRX was just the antithesis of that. It was small, compact, light. It weighed only 1,800 pounds, had quite a bit of plastic, including the fenders. But it was an absolute blast to drive if you were trying to drive in a spirited manner. If you wanted to take corners, it had no power steering, but the manual rack had just the right level of effort, was excellently communicating the road. The brakes were a little mushy, and I had rebuilt the whole brake system. That was just the way that they were engineered, even before I rebuilt the brake system. It stopped fine, but it just didn't have that reassuring pedal feel. You could heel toe it. The brake and the gas were pretty close together. The manual transmission still remains a benchmark for manual transmissions in my estimation. I have not driven better manual transmissions, smoother shifting manuals than Hondas. And this was no exception. I mean, you'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it was brilliant. The only thing that I could kind of nitpick on is the reverse wasn't synchronized. You had to make sure you came to a full stop before you put it in reverse. Otherwise, you were going to get some gear grinding. The engine, when it was running, was superb would be an understatement. I've never felt a four-cylinder so extremely smooth all the way through the rev range, idle to 6,000 plus RPMs. Great mid-range torque, especially once I unhooked the EGR, which it didn't need. It didn't spark knock with the EGR unhooked, interestingly. And it also gave a lot better part throttle feel than with the EGR hooked up. I think because it was jetted pretty lean, hence all the vacuum hoses, etc. under the hood. But you take this engine, and I know there's people out there who watched the Iron Duke video, and I put it on GM's worst list, or the worst list of GM engines, not because of reliability, not because of durability, although it had a little bit of issues in some cases. They did throw rods every once in a while, and they certainly leaked from the valve cover. But they were cheap to operate, reliable, and durable. But they were crude beyond all belief. The Honda was the exact opposite. You'd start it, you'd put the key in, and then it would fire up, and it was brilliantly smooth. The fast idle was a little noisy, but I mean, what do you expect? But at curb idle, wow. And the combination of that engine and that transmission had good mid-range power, shockingly, from a 1.5 liter engine. The transmission ratios were well spaced. It was just a fun car to drive, albeit it only had 13-inch tires. You weren't going around corners very fast. The rest of the car, the ergonomics were pretty good. The turn signals, the heater controls. It had amazing room inside for how small that car was. I'm 6 feet 1 inch. I could have been 6'4", 6'5", and I would have had enough room to spread out in that car. The packaging was excellent. The hatch in the back, you could fit quite a bit. There was a little compartment behind the rear seat where you could stow things in a clandestine manner. But you had room to spread out. It actually feels roomier than a lot of the full-size cars now, with a big chunky center console, because there was no console in that Honda. And you could just spread out. You did sit on the floor, and it was a legs out position, but it was very comfortable. The seats were very comfortable, very supportive. They hugged you in the right places. When you went around corners, the cloth was a nice fabric that kept you in place. And, you know, if I really had to ding stuff, it was an economy car. It was a really cheap car. So the plastics weren't all that high quality, but they were assembled pretty well. I would say the plastic fenders in particular, you got to be careful if you have one of these cars and you're working on it. Don't lean on it, because you're going to be in trouble. You'll break one of the fenders. And, you know, a lot of the parts were kind of fragile as it aged. And if you haven't watched the video on worst engines of all time and the Honda engine in this car, here I'm telling you I love the car, but this is a terrible engine for vacuum hoses. Here's the vacuum diagram. That is a real diagram. It is that bad. And the problem now is, with the age of these cars, these vacuum hoses are starting to get old, starting to get brittle. You can replace all of them. Then you got everything under the control boxes, the solenoids. You've got this funky Keyheim 3-barrel carburetor that it's hard to get parts for. The main problem with this car, if you want to own it today, is it's tough to get parts for underhood items. There's a lot of vacuum brakes and solenoids, and the carburetor is funky. I've heard people have converted them to Webers. I didn't try that. The floats tend to sink in these carburetors as well over time. The other thing that I would nitpick about is the road noise on the freeway. Again, this was an economy car, but it was noisy. It was fine around town, didn't really notice it, but if you were going 75 on the freeway, which it would do all day long, and it would return 35 to 40 miles per gallon doing it, it was noisy. You almost wanted earplugs, and you couldn't hear the radio all that well. There wasn't much sound deadening in the car. And Hondas and the other Japanese vehicles really just had paper-thin sheet metal during this era. So you got to watch out for rust, particularly by the torsion bars and the front suspension and where lift pads go on the underside, because the sheet metal on the underside in particular is really thin, and they rusted like crazy. A lot of the Japanese cars this era rusted like crazy. You have to be careful about that. So make sure that if you're going to buy one, try to get the fuel injection so you're not dealing with the carburetor, which means you're going to get an SI if you want that in the first generation. Make sure that there is not rust on the underbody, in particular by the torsion bars and where people would put lift pads. I would say make sure that the clutch feels good. The clutches on these I thought were quite good. Very low effort, light. And other than that, that's about it. They're pretty reliable outside of the vacuum hoses and the various solenoids. And the rust. You breathe on these cars and they rust. But man, was it a blast. It was so fun to get out of a big American Luxo cruiser and go into this thing, because it was the exact opposite of driving the Luxo cruiser, and it was just as fun. Like I said, the only nitpick I would say is it was not a freeway driving car, especially now. You're driving an 1,800-pound car. That's all it weighed. And think of everybody who has a big macho SUV. You feel diminutive or extremely small when you're driving this car, especially by a semi. I mean, that's one thing. Time has passed it by. Back then, 88 Accord or Corsicas, everybody was driving sedans, and this didn't look so diminutive. But by today's standards, where everybody's got big SUVs and you're crowded around them, it's scary almost when you are driving on the freeway. So that's another thing to be careful about. But other than that, tons of fun car, super comfortable, very roomy, great cargo room, great passenger compartment room, and wonderful manual steering. I don't usually say that, but this was wonderful manual steering and a fun car to drive. Let me know how you like this format and the discussion of this 1985 Honda CRX. From the tranquil setting again, have a good day and enjoy yourself. Take care.
Thanks for watching this video. Please be sure that you like, subscribe, and comment, as that helps the YouTube algorithm serve this up to more people like you. And feel free to email me at rareclassiccars@yahoo.com with any comments on this video format. Thanks again for watching. Check out some of the video thumbnails for items that you may be interested in. And if you're not yet subscribed, click the icon at the top left of the '67 Buick Riviera. Thanks again for watching.